This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek Radio. Today, WorkWeek will look at the recent court victory against Monsanto by Benecia Unified School District groundskeeper Dewayne Lee Johnson. Johnson was a member of CSEA Chapter 1096. Johnson won $32.9 million in compensatory damages and $250 million in punitive damages against the company. He claimed in a lawsuit that as a result of spraying glyphosate-based herbicide Roundup made by Monsanto Corporation, he was a victim of cancer from this chemical. Monsanto, which was recently acquired by the Bayer Company this year for $62.5 billion, has argued that the chemical Roundup was safe and that the cancer that Johnson got was not caused by this chemical spray. After the settlement, $11 billion was wiped off the market value of Bayer. The United States EPA has also told workers and the public that this chemical is safe and does not cause cancer. As most listeners know, there is a cancer epidemic in the United States, and most people now expect to get cancer. Has there been a cover-up of the dangerous spray Roundup and other chemicals used in the workplace and communities? And what is the science behind our determination of dangerous chemicals and toxins? There are also thousands of other workers and community members who have been charged that they have been contaminated as well by the herbicide Roundup. Joining us on WorkWeek Radio today is Carey Gillam. Carey is a journalist who is a member of Society of Professional Journalists. She is also with the public interest group U.S. Right to Know, a not-for-profit food industry research group, and author of the book Whitewash, the Story of Weed Killer, Cancer, and the Corruption of Science. Also joining us in San Francisco is San Francisco Chronicle legal reporter Bob Egelko, who wrote an article in 2012 about another worker, Javier Alcala, who worked at Caltrans and was a member of IUOE Local 3, who was also contaminated by these Monsanto chemicals he was spraying on California highways. He has also been covering the legal ramifications of the Dewayne Lee Johnson case against Monsanto for causing his cancer. Welcome both of you to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So, Carey, you've written a story in The Guardian titled One Man's Suffering Exposed Monsanto's Secrets to the World. Why don't you discuss what the secret was and Dewayne's effort to get it out in his case?
Sure. So there are really two parts to the case and the litigation that's going on around the United States now. It involves actually thousands of plaintiffs. Lee was the first one to have his go to trial, but there are two parts to it. So one is the science part. And this is, according to the plaintiff's side, they're relying on, many, many epidemiology, toxicology studies, and others looking at mechanistic action that does indeed tie Roundup and other glyphosate-based herbicides to cancers, specifically non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So there's the science side. But the perhaps even more compelling side is the side that shows us that Monsanto has spent years, decades actually, trying to suppress that science, trying to hide evidence of harm. And the case that was made was that when presented with the published peer-reviewed independent science tying its chemical to harm, rather than take that to heart and really do more research and warn customers about the risks, Monsanto did the opposite, and it worked to suppress the evidence. It worked to harass scientists. It worked to harass journalists who tried to report on it. And it worked to invent its own science, actually to ghostwrite its own scientific literature to convince regulators that it really was a lot safer than the independent science was showing it to be. So that's what the jurors had to deal with. They had to look at both of those aspects, and they came away saying that, $250 million in punitive damages alone. They really felt that Monsanto's conduct was egregious and needed to be punished.
And you've been covering Monsanto and these chemical companies for a long time, and the issue of junk science or science paid for by corporations, like in the case of the cover-up of the causes of tobacco and cancer, seem to be systemic in our system. Is this the case?
It certainly does seem to be that way, yes. I mean, from the days of tobacco until, just last week when we saw this verdict, it's part of a playbook. We have documents in which they lay out their playbook. We have internal Monsanto documents thanks to this litigation and discovery documents. This is what they do. They ghostwrite the literature. They ghostwrite articles and policy papers for academics. They post things on different websites and set up front groups that are funded by the agrochemical industry but look like they're independent science organizations to weigh in on issues. So It's a vast and very sophisticated network that's designed, to maximize their profits, even if it puts public health in danger.
Isn't this could be considered fraud? Shouldn't it be prosecuted if they're putting up fake documents?
Well, that's an issue to talk to prosecutors about, I suppose. The remedies historically and today have been, in civil courts. Now, the Office of Inspector General has said that they are looking into allegations of collusion between our Environmental Protection Agency and Monsanto. But who knows if that will go anywhere or not.
And we're talking with Carey Gillam. She's an expert and has been studying many years and writing about, as a journalist, these chemicals and the causes of cancer. And also with us is Bob Egelko. And I understand, Bob, that you wrote an article today in the Chronicle that, in fact, there's California is still not going to have any notice on these chemicals, that they may be a threat to your health. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's right. Even though California Health Office decided in July of last year, based substantially on the findings by the by the World Health Organization's body, that glyphosate, the world's most widely used herbicide, was a probable cause of human cancer. But although that was enough to get to a jury, which, having seen a human being and heard the conflicting experts and all, decided that there was enough evidence that Mr. Johnson's cancer was caused by this and Monsanto had concealed it, when you get to labeling, it's considered an act of free speech, because the company's got to admit, our product that does this, and the courts have said that it has to be factual and uncontroversial. And a federal judge in Sacramento, William Shub, ruled in recent months that although California can put this on the list and make their own speech, they can't make Monsanto do it on the label, because that would violate their freedom of speech, because this stuff is not factual and non-controversial. After all, the U.S. EPA has denied that glyphosate is dangerous, and there are other agencies that have said the same, and the science may not be pure, and there may be many things behind the scenes, but as far as the U.S. government's concerned, this at least isn't non-controversial. Therefore, it violates the company's freedom of speech to make them label it. So California can say it all at once. A jury can award $289 million, but the consumers of Roundup and other products are not going to know from the product label any of this. They'll have to read the newspapers, I guess.
And that's Bob Egelko, who's with the Chronicle, reporter, a legal reporter. And joining us also is Carey Gillam. And also, Carey, I guess the free speech beats the right to not be poisoned by these chemicals. You also have some experience with the tactic of these companies of going after journalists. How have they gone after journalists to prevent them from getting these stories out?
Oh, gosh, there are numerous ways. I can tell you just one related to myself, my personal experience. I spent most of my career at Reuters, international news agency, and as I was reporting on the growing science showing harm associated with Roundup and these herbicides, I started getting really negative, critical articles written about me by a group called Academics Review, which says it is an independent, scientific, policy-based organization. Well, the internal Monsanto documents that we were able to obtain show that Academics Review was actually set up by a Monsanto PR agent and was specifically aimed at targeting scientists and journalists and others to try to discredit them and harass them and convince them to drop coverage. So, that's just one example, but there are many more like that. They've gone after a lot of journalists, including journalists at the New York Times and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists. They really want to discourage any sort of coverage of the concerns about their products.
And how was he able to actually prove his case, Dewayne Lee Johnson? Because it seems like the money, the wealth, these corporations have been able to prevent any of these cases really from going forward. And we're going to hear from Javier Alcala, who was a worker in the Caltrans, who actually filed on his own a case in federal court around Monsanto. But how was he successful?
Well, again, there is a body, as we've discussed, of scientific evidence. This is what the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer looked at. There's an extensive body of published peer-reviewed epidemiology and toxicology that shows a connection. Now, the jury did not have to find that this was the sole factor in his cancer. They had to find that it was a substantial contributing factor to his cancer. And, of course, Mr. Johnson had a couple incidences where he was exposed in a rather unusual way. His backpack sprayer hose broke, and he was actually drenched in the herbicide from head to toe, is how they described it. And it was not long after that he developed lesions on his skin where he had been drenched, and it spread and then migrated into his body and his lymph system, and is now this deadly type of cancer throughout his body. So I think that the jury found that in the scientific evidence compelling.
And Bob, your thoughts?
To get to trial, you really have to persuade a judge, and it's happened for a number of judges, but particularly Judge Bolanos in the San Francisco Superior Court for this one, that there's enough evidence that a reasonable jury could find that this was a cause. So it doesn't have to be the cause, and it doesn't have to be, beyond a reasonable doubt or anything like that. So it's a relatively modest standard, and a federal judge in San Francisco, Vince Chabria, has found in separate cases, several hundred of them, that what he considers sort of shaky evidence, contradicted by U.S. agencies and others, but enough that a jury could find that this was the cause. And so it's simply a more likely than not standard, as opposed to the beyond a reasonable doubt standard for criminal cases, or as opposed to the factual non-controversial standard for labeling. So a lot of these cases are going to go to trial. There's something like 4,000 cases out there in state courts, several hundred before Judge Chabria in the multi-district federal court. And the thinking is that we may be looking, if these verdicts stand, and I don't know if Mr. Johnson's damages will all stand, but it seems hard to contradict the jury's factual findings about what caused the disease. If these verdicts stand, we could well be looking at a settlement down the road that in which the company acknowledges or says in any event, to avoid going broke, that we've marketed a product that might cause some harm to you. Here's some protections, here's some disclosures. I'm not saying that will happen, but it seems like the most likely route rather than federal regulatory agencies.
And you were hearing from Bob Egelko. And Bob, you wrote an article in 2012 about Javier Alcala, who was a state transportation worker, who actually got sickened as a result and is still sick. And here's a presentation he made him about his experience.
I spray herbicides for 6 years, killing the weeds around the shoulders of the roads. After 6 months, I started getting respiratory problems that were I never related to the pesticides. And then after that, years later, these respiratory problems get more hard. I started getting headaches every time I have to be exposed to those pesticides that I was spraying. And then after that, I started getting feel dizzy, I started losing all my power on my body, started getting abdominal pain. Later, I started getting more medical attention because most of my medical help that what I get was only from Kaiser, because it's very hard to prove that all these problems come from being exposed to the pesticides. In the year 2006, to the moment that I don't even can walk by myself, I feel in my head that I cannot think clearly. I start getting psychological help and psychiatric help from the 2007, 2008, and 2009. I was out of my work because my body don't has the condition to work. One of these companies is a Monsanto company. And
Mickey Mouse company, man.
Okay. So I put a lawsuit in the state court. I have a friend where he's American, and he speaks pretty good English, so he helped me to fill up my first application for the lawsuit. So then this company removed it from the state court to the federal court. That was a lot more hard to fill up all the papers in the federal court. And they tried to remove this case from the court, based on what they say it's hard to prove that where my respiratory problems come to be exposure to these pesticides. So for this time, I already see like 4 different doctors.
And let me summarize. Isn't it true that you lost the first time in the first federal court? They said the chemical company was right and you were wrong?
Yes.
So after these big attorneys and a judge telling you were wrong, how did you get the nerve to say, I don't agree?
Well, because I'm convinced that after I check all the material data sheet of these companies, I'm convinced that where all my injuries come from exposure to these pesticides. So I have to appeal this case because I feel that where all my injuries come from exposure to these pesticides. So it is my second language, but I try to use the internet to translate. I write in Spanish, so the computer translates to English. So it was hard to fill up all these papers, but I appealed to the federal court in the Ninth Circuit, and finally, after a couple of years, the judges say that I have proofs that where some of my injuries can be exposure to these pesticides.
And that was Javier Alcala. He was a Caltrans worker, and we're talking thousands of Caltrans workers and other grounds workers and people in their homes are using this chemical. Kenneth Martinson was his workers' comp attorney who is still working with him. He's still sick. And the issue of workers' comp obviously is another issue because workers are trying to get treatment. And you covered that story, Bob. Did you expect to hear again about this case?
Honestly, no. To tell you the truth, I wrote about it in 2012 when the Ninth Circuit reinstated his lawsuit, sent it back to the judge in Oakland who dismissed it again. But Mr. Martinson, as you know, says Mr. Alcala is still sick. We've got a new case coming. There's workers' comp out there, which means the employer, an employer fund pays, and there are other work. And it could well be that employers are going to be, exposed here. Mr. Johnson's employer wasn't sued, but now that the knowledge is out there, they're not providing, protection, and quite possibly they are going to be put in the loop as well. Here, Mr. Alcala's employer was the state. And the state would very much like to regulate this stuff. The feds don't particularly want to. The legal system is somewhere in between. And, we're looking at a work in progress, but I think that pressure from the likes of Mr. Alcala and consumer groups and all that, and your other guest, who is doing the research, may well bring about some changes that the legal system can't quite do on its own.
And Javier Alcala also told me that he requested a mask to protect him. He was denied that. Now, Carey, also there's the issue of genetic engineering by these companies developing these products. And one of the things that we've covered in the past in WorkWeek is there's really no oversight of the biotech industry and what they're doing genetically to these products. Do you have any research on that in your experience about genetic engineering developing these new products?
Well, when I took on the beat for Reuters in 1998, genetically engineered crops had really just been introduced, and Monsanto, has made quite a lot of money with its genetic alterations to soybeans and corn and canola and sugar beet and alfalfa and things like that. So, I've covered that industry for a long time as well. The main thing that I always like to point out, I guess, is that as much as the companies who sell these seeds like to talk about, how important they are to sustainability and feeding the world and that kind of thing. What they primarily were about when they were introduced, and really are primarily about today, if you look at how much is planted around the world, is this herbicide tolerance. They were designed to encourage the use of Roundup and Roundup-related herbicides, glyphosate-based herbicides. That's what they were designed to do, and that's what most of the crops planted today, the trait that is most prominent, that's what it is, herbicide tolerance. So in terms of regulation, they are generally considered not to be substantially different than other crops. And so, no, there's very little oversight. The FDA has a voluntary approval process. There's no regulation or requirement that companies provide certain data to the FDA for a lot of these different types of crops. So It's a much different standard than for the pesticides.
And that's Carey Gillam. And, of course, we have OSHA in California, Cal OSHA, and National OSHA. It seems like since this was apparently a systemic problem, you're talking about tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of workers getting sickened by this pesticide. How come this hasn't been a public issue in this country? I mean, it seems to be outrageous that these workers are all getting sick using this chemical, and yet business as usual. It goes on.
Money talks, right? Money is power, and powerful corporations who are protecting their profits, have the ear of our lawmakers and our regulators in Washington, D.C., and they often act on their behalf. We've seen that certainly with glyphosate and Monsanto in the chemical industry. Our own lawmakers held a hearing in February to talk about stripping funding from the Cancer Agency, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, specifically because Monsanto asked them to do that because the agency found that its herbicide was a probable human carcinogen. It's outrageous when cancer is striking 1 in every 2 men in America and 1 in every 3 women that our lawmakers are looking to strip funding from our cancer research agency. But they are, because they don't want to get in the way of Monsanto.
And it's interesting, the media in this country, corporate media, is not really attacking this from a systemic point of view. I mean, the fact is people now expect to get cancer. There's a massive cancer epidemic. Why is it being caused? You would think that would be a national public health issue for all people in the United States, yet the corporate media looks at it as just one company, one chemical, but it apparently is spread out throughout the country. In every area, people are getting sick and getting cancer.
Well, yes. I mean, pesticides generally, of course, it is. Glyphosate is one chemical, and it's used with different chemicals, but in specific products. But pesticides generally, insecticides, fungicides, all of these things that we're spraying on our lawns and gardens and golf courses and children's playgrounds and parks, and, of course, on our food. And they're making their way into our drinking water supplies. All of this is documented, and our top scientists, both in the U.S. and around the world, say we know pesticides contribute to cancer and other diseases. We know that. We know they contribute to neurodevelopmental problems in children. We know that. But rather than act upon that and really do something to protect ourselves and reduce the amount of environmental pollution and toxins, what we're doing is just what you said. We're being complacent. We're being lulled into this place where it's just the way we live. It's just what we expect. We're told we can live with cancer and we can pop a pill and be radiated and take chemotherapy and cut off body parts. And that's just the way it is because we need those pesticides to feed the world. I mean, that's the propaganda. And it seems ridiculous when you lay it out there, but that's what we've come to accept.
And this business, it seems like the profit of these companies takes a priority over protecting workers and the community. Bob, you see any change in the courts, or even there's been no response from the California AFL-CIO? This is obviously a health and safety issue for all workers who use pesticides in the state of California, and with the governor and the responsibility of the state and public agencies.
Well, I guess the only change I've seen in the courts is that there have been judges, state and federal, that have allowed these cases to go to trial. That's not the same as regulation. That's not the same as setting precedents that, here's a new safety standard or anything like that. It's a very indirect way of changing the rules. Money can talk in a different way. A few $289 million damage awards or whatever that amount is on appeal may well change minds in ways that legal precedents won't, particularly when they're being set by courts that may have other priorities in mind. But I guess I'm just impressed by the fact that we have judges in San Francisco, state and federal, and around the country. I gather there's another case coming up in St. Louis that are willing to allow these cases to go to trial when a company on the one side will be presented with a human being on the other. I'm not one to say, here's the right outcome in every case, or you can always prove that it caused cancer. But I can say that when jurors of 12 humans look at a dying cancer patient who's a human, and compare the credibility and their feelings to that of a company, that may be the way to get change that regulations and legal precedents can't bring, and possibly through money, possibly through sentiment or something like that. But the courts I think there's a certain amount of consciousness raising going on in the courts, and maybe it's taking place at the trial level.
Well, very good. I want to thank both of you for joining us on WorkWeek Radio. We've been talking to Carey Gillam. She's an author, has been covering this for many, many years, and a journalist. Also, Bob Egelko. He's a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle. This has been WorkWeek Radio on KPFA and the Pacifica Network. Thanks to our line operator, Cosme Torrey, and our engineer, Erica Bridgman. You can reach WorkWeek Radio at workweek@kpfa.org. You can also find us on SoundCloud at WorkWeek Radio. Solidarity has no borders.
This is a union town, all down the line. This is a union town, all down the line. And if you come to strip our rights away, we'll give you hell every time. This is a union town, all down the line.